Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, or wherever you are, and welcome to BLOXHUB, welcome to downtown Copenhagen, and welcome to this afternoon's local time, this debate on City of Possibilities. A reflection this afternoon on the aftermaths of what can be learned by the pandemic crisis. We're not entirely there yet, we know that, but we are going to reflect and discuss what can we actually take on board in moving forward. I'm Torben Klitgaard, I'm the CEO in BLOXHUB, and we're streaming live from Copenhagen this afternoon. It's a special day, and allow me just to introduce why this is a special day, because BLOXHUB is a community, it's a network for companies, Danish, international members and companies, and we just come out of the annual assembly. And you know, being a community, we're going to celebrate when we have the annual assembly. That's sort of a pivotal activity in any community. And we are very thrilled to announce that the 2020 year, the horrible COVID-19 and pandemic year, at the same time for millions of people, a horrible year, we have to admit that in BLOXHUB we actually had quite a good year. The year 2020 actually introduced to us the feeling of collaboration, the feeling of community. So we've actually seen in the co-working hub in BLOXHUB, we've seen a rise in the occupancy rate from average 80% last year, in the beginning of last year, pre-COVID, till at the end of 2020, a 95 occupancy rate. And at the same time, that's just statistics and figures for many of us. At the same time, it tells me that the notion of actually working together, the notion of co-working, the notion of collaboration is far from dead. Going back 12 months, everyone said that the notion of co-working was dead. It was a dead reflection, it was a dead concept. I imagine, or I remember reading at the Financial Times that someone said, co-working maybe was the business model that died before it ever lived. But going to our own experiences from 2020, we can say for sure that people are actually looking towards co-working. They're actually looking to collaborate and coming together either in digital communities, on digital platforms such as the one we're presenting today, or more importantly for the future, to come back within a more physical location in order to co-work and collaborate. And that's of course why I'm explicitly thrilled that we are having a debate today on the City of Possibilities, working on the notion of we have to collaborate our way back into a new normal. We believe that urban sustainability is best achieved through new ways of collaboration, through new ways of innovation and engagement. And that's why this debate today is so pivotal for the months and the period to come, because actually I think having this very, very distinct panel with us today, we can actually identify new ways of thinking and new ways of thinking ahead. So it's a distinct pleasure to welcome not only you as participants on the virtual platform, the online platform, but also, of course, our distinguished guests in the panelists today. We have Camilla Vandas, the Chief Architect for the City of Copenhagen. A warm welcome to you, Camilla. We have Indy Johar, a co-founder and executive director of Dark Matter Labs. And just for half an hour's time, Indy has also been the new member on the BLOXHUB board. Indy was just elected on the board at the General Assembly just a half an hour ago. So a warm welcome to you. Also, my friend, we're really, really looking forward to collaborating closely with you in the future. Lars Pico, Dean at Build at Aalborg University, a warm welcome to you as well. Signe Brink, PhD, Head of Arts and Activism, warm welcome to you. Here, physically present in the studio, that's really, really something. Inlay Høj, Head of Innovation, Schmidt Hammer Lassen, HSL. Thank you also for participating today. You're a familiar face here in BLOXHUB, and great to have you back. And last but not least, of course, Sarah Jarsbo, Chairwoman of the Association in Sydhavn. Warm welcome to you. But most of you who have actually attended some of our debates here in BLOXHUB earlier on know that we have a fantastic, second to none brilliant moderator for these sessions. Not me, no, but my distinguished colleague, Pernille Berg, who's the science manager here in BLOXHUB. So I'll pass over the word to you and your moderation for the remainings of this afternoon. Enjoy the debate, take part, and I wish you a great debate. Thanks for coming, thanks for joining, and a warm welcome to you, Pernille.
Thank you very much.
Your stage is yours.
Thank you very, very much. And with that introduction, it can only go really well. Such a warm welcome to all of you participating and watching and being part today. I have looked so much forward to this debate. I have had individual correspondence with this amazing panel, and I can promise you that we are looking into the city of possibilities. Because as Torben has just reminded us, we're still in the midst of a pandemic. It is globally affecting us in ways we have not imagined or foreseen, but we have to look ahead. And as I have talked to some of you amongst the panel, we're living in times that require new solutions and new ways of forming these solutions, and we can only do it cross-disciplinarily and with a great passion and imagination. So without you, I would have to say I could not be the brilliant moderator, but I will try and do my best. To those of you participating online, it has been such a pleasure to receive your registrations for today. You will have noticed that we have an amazing chat hostess welcoming you as well. That is my dear colleague. So if you want to ask questions or comments, please put them in the chat, and I will receive them, and I will try and intervene what I know will be a heated debate. So today we look into the city of possibilities. I've divided it into maybe ambitiously 4 chapters. We'll see, because I also know intuitively that my panelists will most likely debate and take charge and skip chapters if you so deem. I will do my utmost. For you, Lars, Indy, Camilla, it is really nice to see you. And rule of thumb, I will of course call on you when I want you, because so it is, that's my task. But I know things will be said where you say, I want to comment. Just raise your hand. Some of you, maybe both hands, so I make sure, yes, thank you, we do a test. Excellent. And I have also written to you all saying I'll allow you to introduce, just say a few words, because this is a diverse panel of participants, as it should be when we're looking ahead. So I will now let you introduce yourselves by answering what is a city of possibilities to you. Now, those of us in BLOXHUB, we're already fired up. So I'm going to start with Signe, and then you guys digitally participating, you can say, oh yeah, I can do better, because now you've seen we're raising the bar today, but I know Signe will start us off on a good tone. So Signe, please, city of possibility.
Thank you, Pernille. Thank you for the invitation for today. A city of possibility, well, I come from, professionally from a festival city. That's where I have my roots in research and the festival. And the festival city is an amazing laboratory for the future of the city. But what is really interesting, and why I also think that urban planners, architects and developers are so interested in the festival city, is the way that we experiment, the way that we actually temporarily can try out solutions for tomorrow's cities. So one thing is, of course, what's behind the festival fence, but there, at least, there's a lot of experimentation on what is actually the benefit of the commons. We always plan for community. We always plan, and that was also what Torben was talking about. The community is more than ever a core thing in how we plan not only our temporary cultural cities, but also the daily cities that we live in. And by community, also in a social, engaging way, where we allow different kinds of cultures, but also artists to be together with architects, planners, musicians, to create a city of of dynamics, but also a city which is, yes, sustainable in a as green way and a green approach as we can, but also sustainable in the way where we take care of each other and have a careful approach, both to the environment, but also to the community.
Beautiful. Thank you very, very much. And Sarah, would you like to continue on that note?
I can do that. Thank you for the invitation. I come from Aarhus, but I also come from an area in Aarhus called South Harbour. Basically, that is kind of my dream city. But the city of, how could you say, the city that I will never really understand, but will keep inspiring me. So it doesn't matter if I come there 3 times a day or every day, I will keep finding new solutions, ways of people engaging, collaborating, inspiring each other, and I will see new things. I will also see people care and give space and room. It doesn't matter where you come from or who you really are. We can meet right next around the corner, or so I think my dream city is some kind of city that I won't ever really understand, but I will keep trying to. I will keep caring and being inspired, but I will also keep caring about the people that will have the possibility of building their own dreams and also engaging and influencing on the city they dream of having in the future.
Beautiful.
That's basically
So
it.
Inly, when you hear these amazing dreams, a city of possibilities, what do you then think?
Okay, so I'm Inly. Hi, everybody. I'll introduce myself later. I'd like to reflect on the story of the festival because it's a really interesting thing, and festivals offer something to the human experience that you don't really get in the structured city. But the best things that happen at festivals are the non-curated experiences. So the thing about festivals and the thing about cities, to some extent, is that there's a level of curation of human interaction, and I guess the violence of a city, or the violence of architecture, if you like, is enacted where there is a level of control where all you have is a kind of binary experience. Do you buy something? Don't you buy something? Can you sit here or not? And in the smart cities debate, there's a lot of this stuff around how much curation of the city there really should be. And if I'm to take that back to the festival is an amazing place where you can experiment, you can try a lot of things. But it is largely a curated set of experiences that you sign up for. But when stuff goes a little bit off, when people start, swimming in piles of poo and diving off stage and hurting themselves and stuff like that, those are the memorable things about festivals. And I think the cities that I enjoy most are the ones that have a lot of empty spaces. You can climb through buildings that are like ruins, or you can make up your own kind of experience. And there is a kind of a lack of that. The richer a city gets, the more prosperous or the more sort of invested in capital a city gets, the more curated it actually becomes. And when we're looking at the city of possibilities, it's perhaps the post-COVID vacuum that's left, which is perhaps the most interesting thing to talk about.
I agree. Lars, you're nodding. Do you agree with Inly? And a warm welcome to you.
Thank you. Am I on? Can I be heard? Yes. Perfect, thanks. So yeah, I'm nodding because I agree with everything that is said, but I'm also having this question while we are talking. I mean, it seems like a simple question, but to me the question is also, what is a city actually? How big should it be in order to be a city? Because I think that we also need to acknowledge that there are many towns or small civilizations where not 30,000 or 100,000 or several million people will live together. And those smaller areas should also be able to provide a safe and inspiring life for people living there, and also a life that is enriched. So I think that's also very important. So that's one thing, that city can also be an area for fewer people living together. But then I also think that it's very important to think about what should a city provide to us. So a small area, a small town can provide some things that will be really good to live in a small area that can provide these things. But you can have bigger cities closer nearby that can provide different possibilities. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that certain cities can provide certain experiences, and not all types of cities can provide the same kind of experiences. And it could be that I live in one city or one small town that can provide some sort of experiences for me, but I know that if I want to visit the opera or something like that, I have to go to another city. And it's actually fine, because that's actually the distinction between, for instance, living in a smaller city that has a very nice local area where I know people and I can enjoy that, but at the same time I could go to a bigger city and enjoy that big city feel.
Interesting. We'll get back to that, because I have a few facts on cities that I'd like to bring into the debate. So I think this is a very interesting comment. Indy, a warm welcome to you, and thank you for participating. A city of possibilities, what is that to you?
I'm personally delighted to be here. I think when I think about this stuff, I look at it from two perspectives. One is the reimagining what we talk about the city, because it's also worth recognizing the city is not a boundary anymore. I think we're living in imagining the city as a system of things and other infrastructures. So I think we have to sort of reimagine the city as not a physical boundary or territory, but actually as a flow of systems. And I think that's really critical if we're going to rebuild a type of a relationship between the material economy of a city, the energy economy of the city, the biological economy of the city. There's all that. Then the second part, I would say, in the possibilities part, is I think a new imagination of human development and a human-machine ecological development. I think going to face have been gen mechanisms of consumption, and previously before that managerialism and production. We're entering a new age which invites us to imagine the role of as not being bad robots, and building the development environment for human-machine ecological systems, I think is going to be one of the key issues and opportunities of cities of the 21st century. And that is going to challenge everything, all the way from the role of for example, the role of a physical office is not going to be about 1 hour meetings. It's going to be about the deep explorations. The face-to-face economy will become more valuable, and it's building the quality of the face-to-face economy is going to be one of the key assets. At the same time, I think the nature of the house is fundamentally transformed from being a place that you sleep in to being a site of production, consumption, and living and human development in a different format. So I think the space of possibilities and the cities of possibilities of the 21st century are going to be quite deeply reconfigured outside the kind of current scope of what we think is a good design.
Thank you very much. We'll dive into some of those comments. I'm very sure of that. And Camilla, city architect, you have now heard so many various interpretations of a city of possibilities. But what is a city of possibilities to you?
Well, I think it's really about the kinds of life we live. So for me, a city of possibility is one that enables us to live full lives. And what's really coming up, I think, in a lot of this is that there are inherently some conflicts. And the conflicts have to do with accessibility to services, to qualities, and also to proximity of space. So when we talk about wanting to be close to nature, if we were talking about being close to cultural facilities, or even something as simple as affordable housing, it's about distance and how you are related to that. So I think that's one of the things that we're going to return to. But I also enjoyed very much this concept of, human interaction and the softness of space, that great spaces are often really welcoming, and they're soft.
Thank you very, very much. Wonderful, wonderful inputs from all of you. And just as you said, Camilla, we'll also address some of the conflicts, because one of the questions that I've actually sent to you in advance is basically the green transition post pandemic era to, and also the ensuring a socially sustainable city. Do those two very, very different agendas, do they actually conflict? And if so, how do we resolve it? But before we dive into that, because I think, Indy, you also touched upon the power of human agency. Just to, I'm going to read out a few facts from the UN as I did my research for today, where it says that, and you know this, it's not new, about half of humanity, 3.5 billion people live in cities today. 5 billion are projected to live in cities by 2030. So going back to you, Camilla, in terms of, just I have a few more facts, but I think it's a stark number when we talk about accessibility and proximity. 828 million people live in slums today. I also think in terms of accessibility, I'm thinking health, sanitation, etc. It's a brutal fact. And interestingly enough, 3% of the cities take up 3% of the planet. So if we think of it in terms of, I'm now kind of raising the contrast, so we have an amazing amount of people living in cities, but cities actually don't take up a lot of space if we look at the planet. So there is a rich, amazing biodiversity of natural resources outside the cities. That's just tying into what you said last. And so the conflict, that kind of potential that you raised, Indy, that we have to reimagine the city, but bringing into that reimagination that we actually want both a green, sustainable city, but we also want a socially sustainable city. Going to you, Sina, because you raised the level of experimentation that the festivals actually create that space. But going from, if you take the experimentations and the good experiences that you have from the festival cities, do you have any idea of how we will address or overcome the potential conflict of ensuring a green, sustainable city and a socially sustainable city?
It's a very big question.
It is a very big question. You're up for it, I know it.
Well, there's definitely something that could be, if we take the outset of the festival city, that addresses the community. The way of engaging a community, and also a festival city as such is not environmentally sustainable. It would be more sustainable environmentally not to do it. So what comes out of it, we really have to look ourselves in the eyes when we want to be environmentally sustainable. Yeah. But there actually comes a lot of other things that can be used in a sustainable ways. And the most important, I think, is the empowerment. Yeah. The empowerment of a community. The ways of nurturing and feeling a community that actually can do a change together, feeling a belonging in a community, either if it's a festival or if it's a part of a city, feeling at home, or if it's a workspace, is a very important step towards also making a change into a greener world, but most definitely in terms of taking a collective responsibility towards a more social engaging future, where we balance the needs for a greener world with a more social responsible world. Yes.
And I think it's interesting because, Camilla, you were also addressing that level in terms of proximity and space. And I think what you're also touching upon is that level of engagement and commitment when you're close to each other, that creates some sense of social responsibility.
we create what Sarah also talked about, the level of, and Camilla, the level of care
Yeah.
and softness.
Yeah.
And we can do all sorts of experiments on living close in the festival city. But one of the most important things also when we ask our participants is the way that they feel a certain kind of responsibility towards each other.
Yeah, excellent. Camilla, you would like to comment?
So we have to lip read.
We do say in surveys that cities are much more respectful. If you live in a city, you're much more engaged and you have a higher degree of tolerance for other people just because we're exposed to each other. And that's maybe one of the things that we learn from festivals as well. And increasingly also in terms of sustainability, how can we live smaller? Obviously, this is globally one thing that we really have to address.
It's a good point. Indy would like to comment.
I want to sort of maybe draw a distinction about what tolerance actually is in a city, because, you know, I've lived in many big cities, and you have tolerance around the things that you're supposed to have tolerance around. So you're supposed to be tolerant of other races and other sexualities, etc. You're supposed to be tolerant of the kind of incursions that naturally occur in the city to your social space. But I would say that in many ways, people that live in the city are relatively intolerant of things that people that live in villages, for example, are very tolerant of. And it's simply because however you grow up, however you live in a space, you have certain expectations of what tolerance is and who to or what to. And so I wouldn't expect that we are any more tolerant in cities. We just have a certain framework of tolerances that we're supposed to be exposed to. So just trying to understand, you know, when you live in a village, for example, you're forced to be much more tolerant of the individual sort of characters and behaviors in a much stronger way, because you're forced to live with them. You can't extract yourself like you can in a city.
There's a level of immediacy, I would assume, in a village, which is obligating. So tolerance, as you're saying, tolerance can be different things. Camilla and Indy, you would like to comment, but Camilla goes first.
Thank you. So one thing that immediately brings to mind for me is the level of engagement, because I think one thing where you might be correct is that when we live in cities, we tend to expect the system, the city, someone else to handle conflicts, to handle the garbage, to handle all of the systems associated with running a city. Whereas if we live in smaller communities, we might be more likely to take charge ourselves and to become engaged and pick up that piece of trash lying in the park. So I think it's really interesting to say, how can we foster that sense of community and engagement also in our larger communities?
It could be, well, I mean, just to follow on with that, and to follow on with what you mentioned, Pernilla, is that, you know, we talk about the slums as a bad thing. But consider that the slums don't have the infrastructure that the rest of the city kind of does. And they're often very cramped and very, you know, co-located people and families, and yet most of them carry along very harmoniously, and they have to tolerate, they have to deal and invent systems to work around those missing infrastructures. And so perhaps maybe instead of us all turning the slums into cities, maybe we should actually become much more like slum dwellers in order to live sustainably.
There's a thought. Indy, you Mark, you had a comment. I don't know if this is the time for that comment, or you've now been inspired by Indy's food for thought.
My contribution was going to just be that, one, I think I'm nervous of putting social and environmental sustainability in opposition to each other. I don't think we can get to sustainability without building the social covenant. So I think these are interdependent realities. The second comment was much more that I think we're at a structural transformation in our relationship with the world. How we understand nature and understand nature as a resource is fundamentally problematic. How we look at the future in terms of the colonization of the future, how we treat each other as effectively in servitude, employment contracts, all these things. I think we're in a structural transformation of our relationship to the world, and that will recast cities and what we perceive of us in a fundamental way. And my question here was, rather than trying to formally make justification for our current city, what are the drivers that are really deeply transforming the city as an idea? And I think that's what we're in the midst of, a radical transformation of our relationship with the world. I think that's paramount to making the transition. And the possibilities are going to be constructed in those transitions.
If I can probe a little bit, because I read some of your blogs, and what you're also writing about is basically what we know as the wicked problems, or as I heard in another podcast for today, that we live in the Anthropocene epoch at the moment. So our problems are so fundamental, are so large. We have the climate change, we have globalization at a scale, but it's all created by ourselves, but we are not able to imagine or fathom the scope and the extent of those issues. So what you're saying is also, when what you're pointing to, that we really need to rethink the system, right? And part of what you've also written is the importance of not only just human agency, if we talk about psychology, but also emotions. So if we talk about the emotionality of cities, I think what you're also, some of the things that you're addressing here is also how we actually perceive of a city from an emotional perspective. That ties into Camilla's point as well, I think. Is that correct? All right, excellent. Because just going to Sara, because you actually have some experiences from Sydhavn, and I read an interview with you where you were saying that you never cease to be amazed with what goes on. So basically, you're at a catch-up stage, because once you involve and engage people, they will surpass your imagination positively. Mm-hmm. So when you're nodding, so that was a correct interpretation of that interview. But then what is it that you actually do to bring that level of engagement and creativity and commitment?
Well, basically, from our association, we've listened, we've asked, we also try to involve in some sense. It's a matter of having different people in a diverse group, but representing something in that matter, and they being able to actually ask within their network. But it's a very diverse, so you have maybe to agree, it must be like homeless people and addicts in the surroundings that actually have coexisted for many years with artists and creative business, and now you have a Danish bank and bigger associations moving in, but it's also the municipality actually having invited people to engage and being a part of, well, now at least, making a different vision, and also inviting everyone in to be a part of building up their surroundings. So basically they do what they cannot do to facilitate it. It will be a matter of actually meeting their needs and then letting them be a part of creating it, as everyone here said. So engaging people, but also co-creating and letting them be empowered, as you mentioned. And
with some of the issues that Indy raised in terms of that we have to build the city differently. As the head of department, Dean of Build at Aalborg University, where you're focusing on engineering and construction, I know you also work cross-disciplinarily. But how do we ensure that creating or building, renovating the current cities will actually incorporate some of these visions and methods that we've heard from Indy and Sara and Signe so far?
Oh, another good question from you, and a super difficult one. So I know that it seems as if I'm stuck in a track, but in the same track. But for me, if I was to answer that question again, it would be very important to distinguish whether I'm talking about a giant city, a mega city, or whether I'm talking about smaller cities, because then the focus would be the scope would be very different. So that is actually also a question to all of you here. Are we only talking about cities that have, more than 1 million people living in them, or are we talking also about smaller villages, towns? What is a city to us in this discussion, this debate? I think that's very important, because when it comes to building and construction, it's very important what kind of focus and scope you have there. Is it high rises or is it single story houses we're talking about?
It's a good point. And I think the size varies, because to us here in Denmark, a big city is Copenhagen with 1 million people. But we don't have to move that far away. Then 1 million is not a big city. So I think just the definition of city is interesting. And Indy, you have a comment to that?
Well, I was just going to add, I think one of the key things to make the city want is to start valuing different things. So we don't look at the collective intelligence of a city as a key strategic asset. We don't look at the decision-making capacity of a city as a key strategic asset. We don't look at the mental health of a whole city as a key strategic asset. We don't look at the imagination capital of a city as a key strategic asset. And if you were to look at any of these things, you would start to think about microbiomes, our food systems, our energy systems, our air pollution, our sound pollution, light pollution in completely different ways. So I suppose one of the key questions I bring to the table is that I think in order to build this city, we have to reimagine the components and the layers of what we value in the 21st century. And I think they'll have to be fundamentally different. And that means public accounting having to change, our understanding of those liabilities and who holds them being able to be evolved as well. So just to add that dimension to it. Thank you so much.
I think it was an interesting, Camilla. I hope you heard it, because Indy is basically saying that we need to also create a new way of accountability. So I think that is a comment begging from you in terms of how do you see that as the city architect, that we need to change how we look at the strategic intelligence, but it also has a consequence in terms of accountability.
I think one thing that springs to mind for me is really how we consider resources and how we start to rethink the building industry in terms of not only our building materials, but also all of the waste that we're producing and how we recycle that in the city. And of course, Copenhagen has some experiences in this, and we're trying to do even better. But when we hear about really rethinking the systems in our city, I think we can be much more refined. And that poses a lot of challenges for us as designers. So how do we start this dialogue? Do we start by, starting with our pen and designing something, or do we go out and look at what are the available materials? And I think that's a conversation that we're increasingly having in the city. How can we use materials at hand, and how do we then dispose responsibly of all of the waste and all of the different circularity that we're working with?
I think it ties in very well with Indy saying that green and socially sustainable, they do actually not conflict, they are interdependent. So I think when you're raising the next thing that you're just raising, Camilla, that also ties into what I heard a few weeks ago in terms that we need to transition the jobs in the construction industry from the 3 Ds to the 3 S's, the safe, skilled, and secure. And I think there is a potential in that transition as well. But Enlai, I know you have a dream, and I thought I have to you knew I was going to ask you about it, because it just resonates so beautifully with what Indy and Camilla have been saying. Your dream is about urban food production.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the intro. Well, you know, it really comes down to the question, and I think Indy is going to appreciate this as much as anybody, is really about what is the city as a system? What does the city actually produce as a byproduct of actually being a city? Because the city actually produces the countryside as well. And it produces the way we consume natural resource, the way we deal with it. So yes, you know, we are increasingly concentrating ourselves into a smaller, well, let's say not a smaller, but a more dense, let's say, framework of living, where we're graduating towards the city and vacating the countryside. The question is, why are we vacating the countryside? Is it because the city is that great, or because the countryside is becoming a kind of social deficit in a way? Is it becoming a place which is increasingly inhospitable to humans, let alone animals, let alone biodiversity? And what we have seen over the past 50 years is a very strong trend, almost an inexorable trend towards industrial monocultures. And that really comes down to the frameworks, the logistical systems by which food is being brought to market and brought to the table. So there's a couple of things, and these are almost two ends of the spectrum here. What is it about our own city experience? What is it about our own personal experience in the city that is actually not what we would want for our future, and what is it for the rest of the landscape that the city very much consumes, which is not what we want for our future? So one of the things that I'm very keen on is actually disrupting the cycle of waste when it comes down to industrial monocultures producing food for cities, and the amount of waste that is predicated in the business model. Because in order to go to the supermarket, you have to show people stuff, and then they have to select some of it and bring it home and do something with it. And there's waste between there and when you actually cook it, some of it is thrown out. There's huge amounts of waste by putting it out to market to show so that it can be selected. And there's huge amount of waste in channeling down to those commodities, which I would call them commodities of foods that we essentially produce and we buy as a symbol. So like a carrot, for example, there are thousands of species of carrots of all different colors. And when we think about a carrot, we think about something that long, that size, no bigger or smaller than that color. And so it as a commodity, just like silver and gold, we don't really have the sensitivity to care for what it might be that we're buying. We're essentially buying symbols of nutrition. Now, when you have that situation, what you get is the whole world producing identical copies and creating an entropy of experiences that get served to you as on the market, rather than a diversity of experiences, diversity of nutritions, colors, flavors, etc., which would happen when a market becomes, let's say, when the customers become connoisseurs. Just in the same way as in the 80s, you'd say, what do you mean, what kind of coffee do I want? You would also say, well, what kind of carrot? What do you mean, what kind of carrot do I want? And so when it comes down to this duopoly between the industrial monoculture and the way we bring food to market and represent it to ourselves, the question is, how do you break that cycle? How do you create food in such a way as that the relationship between you and the food is demanding variation, is demanding quality, is demanding...
I was going to ask you that, and I was going to tie it into Lars's comment in terms of what is a city, what is the size of a city? Can we have the closeness or the network of smaller cities and larger cities, as you said, Lars? And then with Camilla in terms of waste and the materials. All of a sudden we have Inly saying, well, well, let's change our imagination and expectation of food and bring in the diversity. It's good for the biodiversity, but it also, all of a sudden, it implodes how we look at the structures of the city as a system, and the business models. So I was thinking, because that's something that Sina and I talked about, who's actually designing the city? So now we have the food, the dream of food production. Will we bring in the artists to help us realize that dream?
I think that would be a good idea. Yeah, you know.
Yeah, we talked about that, didn't we?
Well, I mean, I think, and you also introduced with the idea of a more cross-disciplinary development of the cities. I think that there's definitely a huge potential in bringing in artists and other resources around the table to develop the cities in new ways. There are new perspectives that can come in with the artistic methodology that doesn't necessarily leads us in known directions, but might shed light on new ways. I actually read of a project and was a little bit involved in a project that Superflex is doing at the moment. You might know about it, yeah, at Roskilde University, where students are involved in developing new projects for the campsite, but they co-created together with maritime species. So there's been workshop between maritime species and students.
Yeah.
However, that unfolds, but it's quite, it might sound humoristic, but it also quite ambitious in terms of trying to reach out to how do we understand nature and a more sustainable approach. And I actually think that artists can be a really good group to put in there, but we need to pair up with planners. We need to pair up with architects as well. We need to pair up with the municipality to co-create in terms of ensuring a platform where there's a broad benefit from these processes.
How does that sound to you, Camilla? We need to pair up. The artists alone can't do it. We need to pair up. We need to pair up with the city planners, the architects, and I would include Sarah in terms of we need to include the people that will actually be part of that community or commons where they live. How does that sound to you, Camilla? Is that already an embedded practice?
I think it is in so many ways, but then inherently there are conflicts along. You know, how do you navigate when the same space, you want to use the same space for various purposes? Let's just, for instance, in a Copenhagen examples right now, where there's a space that could potentially be used for food production, but it could also be a space for urban nature, or it could be a space for solar paneling and production of green energy. And all three are, you know, wonderful, worthwhile activities. How do you make that priority? And the way we're doing it, obviously, right now is in terms of politics, right? So we elect someone to take that decision on our behalf.
It's a good diplomatic answer. We'll allow it the politicians, because that's also the structure of cities, that they are actually political entities as well. Is it possible
But at the same time, right now, we're seeing, you know, uprising, you could say, where the public is becoming increasingly empowered to partake in that discussion and engage with even the elected politicians and start to change this system. And you know, globally, we're seeing this in so many ways, from Black Lives Matter to the Me Too movement, to in Copenhagen, some discussions around local area plans and urban nature. So I think this power balance is really interesting and maybe a sign of engagement.
But how do you give a voice to the voiceless?
Did you hear Enlai's question, Camilla?
A voice to the voiceless. Yeah, I mean, right now, you know, this is like the fourth power. So everything which is on social media, Facebook and so on has enormous power right now. And I think the George Floyd lawsuit showed us that the power of just one person with an iPhone documenting what was happening changed that whole dialogue.
Sure, but I mean, the voiceless, meaning the people, not the dead people, not George Floyd, but I'm talking about plants and animals, rivers, parks, little creatures, and things that have not yet been imagined are also, if we can, let's put it this way, if in the city, I live just next to Stroll, and there's essentially only two things that I can do in Stroll, and that is to shop or not to shop. You know, it's almost like it's a Shakespearean conundrum, to shop or not shop. That is the question, and the difficulty behind that is that before COVID, before all these closures, before some kind of commercial catastrophe, that was actually fine. But if you think of all of the things that you love to do, like, you know, weird games, dancing, having sex, you know, jumping off things. I like jumping off things. All of the stuff that you consider to be a fantasy of your existence in the world, there's not that much stuff you can do on Strotl.
But we're actually playing with that, and we're really inspired by Scene and by festivals. So this summer, for 4 months, we're trying to reimagine the area around Strotl and taking away some parking spaces and say, what are we going to do instead? How will we use our city centers? How will we integrate more cultural activities? How will we have more urban nature? And we're using something like pilot projects and a temporary space like a festival to experiment with this, to learn to be smarter, and that will then influence our planning going forward.
I mean, that's super cool.
So Indy, is that one method of reimagining city as you would that you had imagined? That this is one method where we actually learn from festivals? I know there's also a lot of learnings from festivals in Scotland and Great Britain.
Yeah, no, I was going to build on a couple of things. I think one is that, so I think, yes, we can re-permission the city. And I think there's a whole bunch of really interesting work starting to happen. We're working with Daegu City in South Korea, looking at how you re-permission the city using real-time licensing, and so that's one aspect of it, and then we can do that. I think there is an important question that's being raised about future generations and responsibility to future generations, and the people that are voiceless are not only the plants and animals, but the future generations that will live for thousands of years, hopefully, in front. But I think the interesting question is at the center of it is, how do we make decisions? So our current planning thesis and how we plan the city is a function of coming out of nuisance laws, of how to mediate two people having a disagreement of how they related their uses. That's where the history of planning comes from. And I think we're into a new dimension of how we negotiate the future and the relationships. And I think we have to become radically imaginative about how we negotiate both current and future stakeholders and the risk we generate for future stakeholders, which is totally unaccounted for into that story. So I think maybe there's a revolution in reimagining planning and how we plan and negotiate ourselves together. And that, I think, is becoming and a planning which is not about delegation of division of rights and space, but new forms of relationships to those rights and spaces in really radical formats. So we're doing work in Canada, which is looking at new treaties to land as opposed to ownership of land, so treaty relationships. So how do we have a new type of treaty with the spaces and spatial spaces that we live in? So something really important here, that we're in a third generation conversation of how we negotiate our presence in the city. And I think nuisance to planning was step 1 and 2, I think we're in another stage, and with hyper complexity and richness to all the issues that were being raised around, is the city do we put a meadow there should be no green grass. Everything should be a meadow by far. So to all the other possible uses, how do we negotiate these uses and complex needs in a really 21st century way?
I think it's a brilliant comment. Who do you invite into the negotiation? How do you engage the diversity of people that you want to partake in the negotiation? Can you share with us some experiences?
I think one of the interesting things that I think is slightly oblique, and I think was being hinted on very beautifully, in New Zealand, a river is being made self-sovereign, right? So we've got forests being made self-sovereign. So I think in that reality, humans don't control the river, but our relationship to it. And I think that starts to change. We're doing a piece of work to make a house, self-sovereign public interest house. It's called a free house because it operates. And that starts to change our relationship with buildings and environments from that of stewardship. So I think we're in a kind of structural transition, and that requires us to reimagine the relationship of public good, what stewardship looks like as opposed to rent schemes. So I think it's a structural transformation. This goes back to the point I was trying to make earlier, that we're in a structural transformation of how we relate to the world, and that will manifest every part of our existence in the city, and our notions of the city and our notions of the spaces in between the city.
And the impetus for that structural change, where do you see that coming from?
Fundamentally, I don't think there's any other dealing with the scale of the transition that we're in the middle of. So, I mean, just to be clear, like we're all heading towards about 3.2 degrees of temperature rise. And the scale of social inequality that we're about to see and are in the midst of, even as COVID is just the beginning of a series of global strategic risks. And every time those risks manifest, they will drive inequality, and they will accelerate inequality in our system because of the disaster capital nature of how we structured our economy. So I actually think this is a foundational transition that we're in the middle of, and it is the only way we're going to look at the future in really radical formats. And at cities of the 21st century, unless they are radically releasing the human, emotional, their creativity, cognition, and collective intelligence capabilities, unless they're able to release that, they won't be the value-added engines of the 21st century. So there's a new human development capacity that's required, which isn't just about us being fit as units of labor, but actually going from an extrinsically owned economy where we are extrinsically organized to function in particular ways to intrinsically effervescent with regards to care, creativity, complex cognition. That is a new type of economy with a new type of relationship, with a new type of actually what it means to be human at the center of it. And that is got to be the future possibility of the city. I've spoken too much.
Thank you very much. I was just about to say to you that it's almost as if you've read an interview with Sarah where she says, I wish that we would let the children learn rather than make sure that they strive just to get credentials of a piece of paper. And I think you must have read that interview because I think that's exactly what you meant when you said those lines. Lars, you actually raised your arm, and I'm glad you did, because I have that question for you that you know is coming. That beautiful vision, the impetus for change that India's just outlined for us, that it's not a question of whether we want to, it's a question that we have to. So how do we ensure that the buildings, I'm going back to that built environment, how do we make sure that the infrastructure, that the buildings that are already here that we have to reuse in a different way, how do we ensure that that is done with that sense of negotiation and co-creation?
I think that there's one very important thing that we really need to focus on, and it's one of those things that can very easily be forgotten. Right now we talk so much about the greener cities, the more sustainable cities, but we actually forget that we don't really have a standard for measuring how big the carbon footprint is of a building. And that's something that is going to be crucial to find out if we want to construct greener buildings. We need to understand when is a building actually greener and when it's not greener. We need to be able to measure that. So we desperately need data on the life cycle of a building. We also need to be able to work with our data of understanding our buildings across countries. Right now, the data that is produced in Denmark is very difficult to use in other countries because we have our own way of doing it in each country. So that is, to me, a huge obstacle. And without data and standards of understanding the carbon footprint of a building and what we do to a building, then we can get nowhere. So that is a really, really important task right now. And I think perhaps even the most important.
Yes, I would tend to agree with you. And we have from the audience, and thank you very, very much. You feel free to comment and ask questions. We have from Sustainable Urbanism a concern. So here's the concern, guys, because we have to listen to concerns. A concern I have is that only some cities will learn from the pandemic. We see Paris, Barcelona, Vienna, all in the news with permanent responses, but they're already great cities in the right. But there are many other cities like Kuala Lumpur, Delhi, Kinshasa, etc., where there are real needs. And we continue. This affects international disparities. How do we level that? How do we make sure that the disparity does actually not increase? And I think that ties into very well into what you were saying, Indy. And I'd like to bring you into this debate as well, Sarah, because you have experiences with very different people being committed in a spatial area, collaborating, even though they are very different. So given sustainable urbanism's concern, do you have any advice? What can we do? Any comments?
Well, I could have my concern as well,
Yeah.
but I see it as a sharing point of view, and that people would be able to. Well, let me just start at a different place. I see that being a bit strangers towards each other in the city because of COVID, we had to have that distance. I think we actually had a longing to be closer, and also it created some kind of awareness that we are actually sharing much more space in the city that we actually thought of every day. And I think that will create different solutions. It is already like a tendency, and Lars also mentioned that the smaller cities and more cities will probably also come in the future. And I think the question is, how do we make these cities just as interesting? Because I would not be the one making the decisions as the politicians to actually say, stop, now we're too many, and we can't just let the buildings being built taller and taller, and which materials are actually putting the traces back to making the sustainable city. So I think it's also a matter of the social sustainability. Where do people feel the belonging and are not being more and more lonely? And you know, there's a lot of things coming out right now, but it doesn't mean that we're going in the right direction. I think we have to understand more to actually make the right decisions. And yeah. So basically, I think it's a matter of sharing much more if we want to get closer.
Yeah. I read over the weekend a lecturer at the New York University had allowed his class to design the cover of the New Yorker as a response to the pandemic. And a lot of the various covers actually represented loneliness and at the same time the sense of belonging. So I think you're tapping into an emotion that a lot of us can relate to. Certainly the students in New York could. It was quite stark. Indy, yeah,
Can
sorry.
I just say one
you
last
can?
thing? I think it's also something that festivals from Burning Man, Borderland, it's also something that has inspired us to use less the whole waste material, actually, how do you say, being more responsible for your own waste and also share what resources and what you have. I think I see that in some sorts of responsibility in the area of South Harbour where we can share spaces, but we can also share the work and actually do, I don't know how to put it in English, but actually share the resources and make a good future together. So I think it's
so there's
very much
there's a sense of connectivity. So in that smaller space, you're able to connect, and I think that's also one of the things that Inly and Lars you were alluding to in terms of the size of the city. But a large city can still have that shared of intimacy and connectivity.
Yeah, the whole community.
Yeah. So Lars, Indy, and Camilla, we don't want to leave you out in terms of the concern when sustainable urbanism is raising that concern that we don't want an increased level of disparity globally speaking. What would be your take on reducing the disparity? Camilla? I see that you're eager just to jump in and comment on it.
Well, I think it's really about one of our initial comments, which was about proximity and accessibility. So how do we increase accessibility in cities? And obviously, a major component in this is education, and it is public transportation, because both those two factors open up the world in terms of providing better equity and opportunities. Of course, they are in some ways metaphysical, but they also land in very physical structures, public investments into sustainable modes of transport and into something as simple as providing good daycare or good public schools, which I really think are part of the sort of the heart of any community. So when we talk about creating communities and resilience, you know, where do we start? And I think Sarah's quote about children was such a beautiful comment as well. You know, so that empowerment actually starts at a really early age, and as a society, we're responsible for fostering that and investing in it.
Beautiful, and I think it ties in with the 3 S's, and I know it's maybe far stretched, but the education of today, if we transition that to the education of tomorrow, also ensuring that the people that will be working globally in the construction industry, that their education and their future jobs will be skilled, will be secure, and will be stable. So that's, I just threw that in when you said education, Camilla. Lars, you also indicated that you had, you were inspired.
I was inspired indeed. First of all, I think it's a super difficult question, and I think it's difficult to solve. But one small thing that could perhaps help is that sometimes when you have a good solution or good technical advances, sometimes you can see that some countries can leapfrog and go directly to the good solution. So I think that's something that we should really try to advance. And first of all, get the data so that we can measure which solutions have the smallest carbon footprint and make them cheap and very readily accessible, so that countries and cities that are still developing can go directly to the best solution instead of make all the trial and errors we've been doing over the years. So perhaps that could help a bit.
I think so. When Indy is talking about that structural transition that is taking place because it has to, we don't have a choice, we're also talking about the systemic knowledge sharing. Yeah, you're all nodding. That's very good. So Inly, how does that tie into our food production?
It ties in a lot. Maybe I would just like to sort of reflect on Camilla and what Indy was saying, because I think one thing that the conversation has been about, and it's really about how do you make a decision and who makes a decision and how do you resolve conflicts. And one of the really interesting and most important things about transition to a brighter future, if you like, is the idea that you, as Camilla sort of like hinted at, you have to deal with the existing conflicts of any situation and imagine potential futures that start from those conflicts. So then when it comes down to things like our existing city the way it is, one thing is very clear, and this is something that we've been studying very closely at SHL as well, is how do you save buildings that are marked for demolition? How do you convert a city by reusing, the topic of the discussion today, how do you convert a city by reusing what exists and imagine possible futures? Now, this is where governance has a kind of crutch in a way. As Indy said, planning laws come out of nuisance laws, but structurally speaking, you have a situation where laws tend to only be able to govern whether and what, and never how something is done, right? You can't ask a law to tell you how something is going to happen. So there has to be some way of a kind of supra-governance, if you like, a way of making these possibilities come to the surface and let's say, supporting those possibilities rather than leading from a rule-driven perspective or a planning-driven perspective. Now, that from our side, what we're looking at is ways that it's actually just through process or through examination of what exists, it's more financially profitable and socially profitable to recover what is existing in terms of structure, because it should be cheaper. Most of what is there is the average office building is designed to last 500 years. So why are we demolishing it? And that's the reason why we're demolishing those things, is because there's social or financial incongruencies between what exists and what could be there instead. Now, if we can use enough creative force to mold what exists into a brighter and more interesting possible future, that actually requires creativity, and it requires support for that creativity to actually happen, or governmental influence. That's the same when it comes down to any structure. So to your question, what is it about food? What have we got as current infrastructures that are natively destructive? And what do we have as current infrastructures that could be transformed or natively support what we want to do? And imagination is every part of that. And so the big open question for the group is actually, how do you encourage creativity in a way that is positive, and also how do you change the hierarchy of decision making so that it is mutually beneficial for current and future generations of humans and animals and plants, etc. And so then the question is, when you go out and survey the community or have a festival or do all of these things, how do you create a framework, a hierarchy of importance where these voiceless things have a voice? And how do you weigh one factor against another? And I think
it would almost be cruel to then say that's a wrap, because I think, Camilla, it must have just sparked so many comments when we're talking about flipping the hierarchy of decision making, talking about a new type of governance. So I can't wrap up this wonderful debate. That would be cruel. I'm gonna allow you to just comment on that, because I think it ties in with some of the things Sina has also said of the experimentation. But still, you deserve the 30 seconds comment for that.
The very small comment would be that I think we have to, as you say, use innovation to start to imagine what can happen, and then start to listen in a new way. So one thing that has come out of a citizens' assembly that we had in the city center about a year ago, these pilot projects, experiments that I mentioned earlier, are a result of listening more to what Copenhageners want their city to be. So I think that's a really good starting point, innovation and listening.
Beautiful. And on that note, I have to say that when we live in the times of a shift in paradigm, it's not always that we're able to navigate in that shift and be very clear. I hope all of you that have attended and participated in this debate, that you have taken the debate in its spirit, that we're looking into the future, the city of possibilities. You have heard from amazing people. This is not a question of whether we want to. We have to, but we need to address both the psychology of us as human beings, our emotionality, our connectivity, our creative ways of co-collaborating, of living together, the power of artists and allowing artists a voice. And as Enla is also saying, we need to flip the hierarchy of governance, but we've had a city architect here today sharing with us that's not a problem, because we have to. And we've heard from Indy that this is not just the systemic change of structure, we also need that human agency. And we have technologies around us that can facilitate the transition, and we need to develop the metrics so we can compare globally, as Lars is saying. And we need young people with their hearts to go out, educate themselves, and participate in shaping the tomorrow of a green and socially sustainable city. We only touched on the surface today, and we will continue this topic. I would have to say I could not have imagined a better panel, so we'll have to invite you all back, hopefully physically, all of you, because it has been wonderful to have eye contact with you guys digitally participating, but you haven't been able to see us, and we've been smiling and waving at you now for the past hour. But listen, you have been formidable, you've been brilliant, you've been awesome, and to those of you watching, you have been absolutely brilliant, and thank you very, very much. We look forward to seeing you again, and a huge round of applause to you for participating and sharing with us your passion, your integrity, your wisdom, and your visions for the future. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.